Thank you, Dale. Likewise, it's a pleasure to be here, and all good economists, I'll do my best to get us back on time. Haha, for 5 minutes early, all right? I gained at least 5, right? All right, we'll wait and see if we can, I might have messed it up when I try to open it. Very good. So these slides are gonna be available also on our agmanager.info website. If you haven't been to that website, it is our outreach resource for the Department of Agricultural Economics here at K-State. If you go there, across the top, there's a bunch of tabs. One of them is called Contributors. Click on it, and then I'm one of, I don't know, a dozen economists that show up. If you find my name, you'll find these slides. They were posted here this morning. I walk you through that, because I quit carrying these things in paper format quite a while ago, because half of them stay up front, so it's pretty wasteful. But the second part is, a fair amount of what I'm going to share with you today gets updated weekly, monthly, quarterly, and I'm giving this talk somewhere else, and I encourage you to go to that website and view the more recent set of slides as things go. So it's part of my way to bait you to go there too, to get that. The other reason I tell you that is you're welcome to write down anything you want, but a PDF of these slides is already posted, so everything's available to you. So hopefully I don't put anybody asleep, because I am pre-lunch, so it's not as hard to keep you awake as it is post-lunch. But in case I do, I'm going to put a summary in front of you. I like to do this anytime I'm given a targeted, lengthy outlook talk, is what's the punchline of what's going on? And I'm going to give you a lot of details behind these points, but the key summary would be, we have notably higher cattle prices now, and we're expecting to sustain higher cattle prices for the next 2 years at least, primarily because notable support from tight supplies, so think low hoof count, and beef demand has been, I've got mixed up here, but it's held up better than we thought it would in 2023, and it was really good for a couple years leading into this. So tight supplies coupled with at least okay beef demand leads to higher prices throughout the entire chain. Now I'm going to geek out on that a lot over the next slides, but that's the summary point, and I'll put some time stamps on that and so forth. But before I lose you with details, that's the take-home message. The next 2 slides come from LMIC. There's a group called Livestock Marketing Information Center, not to be confused with the local LMIC. This is one based in Denver. K-State, A&M, a bunch of other land-grant universities, USDA agencies and the like are members of that group. That LMIC pulls together a lot of information, tabulates it, and me as the K-State rep has access to all that, so I don't have to sustain these tables and so forth. I like to use them to kind of give you a roadmap of where the general consensus among geeks like me, livestock economist, is. Each row up here represents a different quarter, and I know if you're in the back you can't read this, but I included arrows up here. The yellow is for the calendar year. We have 2023 followed by 2024 followed by 2025. Obviously the fourth quarter of 23 and then all of 24 and 25 are projected values, but the general trend is very simple to summarize. We are expecting to continue to harvest fewer animals. Here in 2023, we're likely to harvest 5.5% fewer, mainly steers and heifers, than we did in 2022. We're going to further reduce that by 7.5% in 24, and we're going to reduce it even further in 2025 by 5.5%. So before I go any further, this is where my comment about tight supplies comes from. Smaller calf crops in the past pretty much dictates lower slaughter in subsequent quarters, and we're on path for a notable lower fed cattle slaughter over the next 9 quarters is what's up here being projected. In the middle is dressed weights. So hoof count is one thing, but we need to consider what's the weight on those animals when they're showing up through the plant. And throughout 24 and 25, we're projecting maybe a 1% increase in dressed weights. Some improvement on feed cost is part of that. It's expected to sustain. And the second part would be, we're gonna have some empty bunks. And we could talk about that in Q&A if you want, but at the margin, there's gonna be an incentive to add some days on feed if it pencils at all, because it's better to keep the hotel sort of full than have it empty. And combined, that would probably push up dressed weights as well. But regardless, those are 1%, maybe 1.5% increases in dress weights. That certainly does not offset 5 to 7% declines in hoof count. So to your all's far right is the net of that, it's commercial beef production. So how much beef are we producing here in the US? Here in 23, 6% decline in the amount of beef we're producing compared to 2022. Looking out to 24 is an additional 6%. Looking out to 2025, about a 4.5% decline. So less beef, which is not surprising, right? That's the core source of price support so far. This slide is set up the same way, but now it has price information. The last one was pounds and animals. 5 market price followed by yearlings and calf prices. Again, We have historical for 2023 and then projections for the next 9 quarters. The arrow to your right tells the story. We have notably higher prices now, and they're projected to go up a little bit more. The rate of increase is expected to decline, and I'll show you that in chart format in a minute, but sustaining higher prices. Specifically for the fourth quarter, upper 180s, low 190s was the projected fed cattle price. 7/8 weights, 257 to 260 is the number that's up there for Q4, and 285 to 287 is the number that's up there for calves. I'm just going to give you the punchline for the calves, just to drive the point home for the next 2 years, and I'll come back to this as we do charts going forward. But if you look out to Q4 of next year, what's up there is 300 to 310, so $3 calves is the prevalent forecast. There's going to be some calves sold for $3 in the next month. Not all calves, but there's going to be some sold for $3, and we'll probably flip from that to being the norm of $3 calves next fall. In 2025, fourth quarter, 325 to 340. So you can interpret that as it'll be more inferior calves that go for $3, and more typical go for 325, 340. So projected revenues for the cow-calf side are expected to go up notably, and they definitely have went up here in 23 compared to 2022. For those of you that are in the background stocker business, that's a much higher expense for your incoming animals, right? Next to that is the projected for 7/8 weights, which is getting closer to what at least most of you be thinking about selling off grass or wheat pasture. And those animals are also going up, consistent with it. So I gave you a minute ago, the projections for Q4 this year was 257 to 260. Looking out throughout 2024, 256 to 290 is the range across those 4 quarters as we look out throughout the calendar year. I'm going to give you some beef basis numbers for specific weight addition enterprises in a few slides, but not surprisingly, yearling prices have come up as calf prices have come up. And fed cattle prices are up and expected to stay up, getting in the upper 190s to $2 as we go through 2024. So now most of you know I do this, I'm going to walk from the mama cow towards the consumer, just like follow the cow to the plate. I think intuitively is a way to give these talks. So I'm going to spend some time on the cow herd, talk about expansion and so forth, and work our way towards, I'll kind of end with some beef demand commentary. What I have here is a chart, again from LMIC. It starts in 1993, and it goes out through 2023, and this is the USDA estimate for the domestic beef cow herd. And I'm going to call out some specific things. First is kind of where did we start this year? We started January 23 at 28.9, barely below 29 million beef cows, which is almost exactly how we started 2014. Rounding error is basically the same size as the herd. This cycle peaked in 2019 with 31.7 million cows. Some historical context is important. That's why I like this slide, is if you go back a ways in time to 1996, which was the peak in 2 cycles before, we were at 35.3 million cows. So even pre-pandemic, so I'm going to separate pre-pandemic from the current situation for a moment, we shrunk the national herd a lot, right? We went from 35.3 to a low of 28.9 in 2014, and we were growing the herd going into the pandemic, and we declined it since then. These numbers are important to keep in mind when we start talking about how many cows we might add back, is why I'm interjecting it, because there's a lot of discussion about building the herd back, and we're going to talk about that. But I think some context about what the recent high, what historic highs was, is important to keep in mind. And it's real important to keep in mind, we produce a lot more beef with these 28.9 million cows now than we did the same number of cows in 2014, and certainly the same as we would have if we cared like 25, 30 years ago. So improvements in breeding success, weaning success, mitigating death loss, in the yard, conversion rates, you name it, right? Just everything that speaks to efficiency gains in the industry. A net result of that is we get more sellable pounds of beef net for every beef cow in the U.S. system. The real reason that's important is we need fewer mama cows to hit a aggregate beef production target because of that. So I'm trying to set you up for, I don't think we're going to get to 32 million cows on the next cycle. And if we do, we're going to have a lot more beef being produced from those 32 million cows than the same 32 several years ago. And I think that signal will show up because of that, because the economics in the industry start with who wants beef, how much beef do we have, and it works backwards from that through fed cattle, feeder cattle, and calf prices. So some context on the number of cows and the amount of beef we get from them and so forth, I encourage you to keep in mind over the next few years when we're talking about rebuilding the herd. This is just a cattle cycle chart. Most of you know, historically we've went from the bottom in the herd size, grew it and shrunk it, and it took 8 to 12 years for that sequence to occur. We currently start, this year was year 9 in the current cycle. I think we're gonna be down a little bit come January, not a lot, but down a little bit. So we'd be in year 10 of this cycle. And from a historical perspective, we're quote unquote due to start rebuilding. And there's definitely an economic carrot to the extent Mother Nature allows it for us to start to do that. And I think we're going to. So I use the term Mother Nature. I'm not sure I'm a good economic forecaster, but I know I'm not a good weather forecaster. Sometimes the weatherman makes economists look good, is one of their roles in the world. I bring to you the drought monitor, and these are time stamped for last week. So to your right is the National Drought Monitor for the week of September 19th this year, and I've included the same period last year for context. Please note first, in Kansas, this time last year, roughly everything west of Hayes and everything south of I-70 was in pretty bad shape per the drought monitor in September. Fast forward now, the state as a whole is in better shape. There's a good number of acres under the Flint Hills, which we're on the northern end of, that are still challenging, but for the state as a whole, conditions are better than they were. The West, so now let's get outside of Kansas for a moment. A good chunk of the West last year was under some form of short-term or long-term drought. A lot of that is improved. Something else that shows up that's not good for the cattle industry is East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, so forth. There's a lot of dark brown, so forth, bad drought conditions that have developed there that on balance were not there last year. So who is in better shape differs on where I'm talking. Here in Kansas overall it's better, but where we're sitting there's still acres that are a challenge. I follow that. But I think it's useful to overlay on top of those kind of maps where the beef cows are, because keep in mind the calf market is mainly nationally determined. There's regionally varying bases, but the economics are a national story for our calf value. So let's overlay, mentally, we've got that drought map, and then we have a good feel every January of how many cows are in each state. So if you overlay those two, you can get numbers like I have up here for you, and I'm gonna interpret these for you to make sure you track me. So a week ago, so again, middle of September, about a third, so 31% of the US beef cows were in states that had 40% of their pasture poor or very poor. So to put that in English, roughly a third of the beef cow herd was in states where the conditions are bad. Instead of a third, last year that number was 45%. So the third stinks if you live in that third, don't misunderstand me. But in aggregate for the country, we've had notable improvement in pasture conditions because there's a lot fewer cows that are residing in areas that are poor or very poor. That's balanced out by the information to your right. It's the same thing, but now let's look at the good conditions. Middle of this September, 41% of the cows were in states that had 40% of the pasture, good to excellent, so conditions were good on the ground in those states. And that is up from basically a third, 33% last year. So my punchline is, nationally the herd is in a better forage, Mother Nature, oriented position to sustain expansion than it was a year ago. Make no mistake, I know there's individuals in this room that wouldn't agree with that because their ranch isn't, but I'm trying to impress on you that nationally the herd is better, the landscape is more supportive of expansion. And if you want more on that cattle cycle dynamic, my comment about the amount of beef we can get on each cow, what that means for likely herd size going forward and so forth, there's a fact sheet that you can pull up on our Ag Manager website that's got a lot more of that kind of information. And if you find yourself, I've been speaking to lenders this week, so I was in Garden City Tuesday and then we had lenders here in town yesterday. I suspect there's going to be a lot of discussions between lenders and producers on borrowing, to expand the herd, or discussions on I'm going to hold back my own heifers and therefore I'm not going to make the same repayment as a plan. Those kinds of discussions. Whether you're a producer or somebody that works with producers, this is why I set this up. I encourage you to make use of this particular tool or other ones like it that are around the country. I think purple's good for your soul, but there's ones that aren't purple from other universities. The point of this Excel tool is to calculate the net present value of adding a female to your herd. So what you do when you open this up, and there's some preset values in there that are changeable, so they're sort of USDA best kind of parameters to get us started. But what do you expect the calf price to be over the next 7 to 10 years? And you can change each of those or each individual year to meet your own expectations. What's your cost to run a cow each year? What's your discount rate for future years? So how much do I discount future cash flow 6 years from now, 8 years from now, and so forth? Those are the key kind of parameters in this decision tool. We have base ones for you, but if you have your own guesses, you can update it. And what the outcome, or the main number that comes from this tool, is a number that geeks like me would interpret as the net present value of adding a female to your herd. And let's just say the number that comes out of this $2,500. Just humor me and say that's the number that comes out. If you can buy a female that fits that story for less than $2,500, and you personally are comfortable with the risk of doing that, that tool says go buy it. Because the value of adding her to your herd exceeds what it's going to cost you to pay for it and do it. Conversely, if the market says no, you got to pay $3,000 for it, but what you put in says $2,500, if you choose to make that investment, know you're gambling or you're accepting a lower return or those kind of things. That's the point of this tool. I'm not trying to talk people out of rebuilding and expanding. I'm trying to talk them into doing their homework and at least know what you're doing is the point. So I have a few of these kind of charts, again from LMIC. These are historical prices. This one here is for calves, specifically 5-6 weights here in the Southern Plains. The solid blue line is the current year. The darker dashed line is last year, which is 2022. And then the prior 5 years is summarized here in the red line. These charts are real easy to interpret this year because we've just been in a bull market. So there's been a couple weeks that have been down on the week before, but overall, throughout all of 23, we've continued to expand on the price gains compared to 2022. To the extent that we've added $80 to $90 by the time we got to September per hundredweight to the calf market. So there's a lot of folks that are going to sell a calf for $500 more per head this fall than they did last fall. Is the punchline of that. So revenues themselves, to the extent you had calves to sell, are going to be higher. What about this coming fall? I mentioned beefbasis.com. I've used this every time I've given a talk for probably 10 years now, and I'm happy to take questions about this, but I find it a useful projection tool for feeder cattle prices. So I ran this for Salina this morning. Supposing you're going to sell a calf, specifically 6-weight steer, the middle of October, what you get from this tool at the moment is $282. So if you want to project a price for about 3 weeks out, $282 for a 6-weight steer here in the middle of Kansas. Most of what I've given you until this slide is all revenue oriented because it's calf price stuff. That itself tells you nothing about profit. We got to talk cost for a moment to understand what the profit situation is. So this slide gives us some cost info. Again from USDA 1996, and I'm gonna walk over here so I'm not standing in front of you the whole time. We've notably increased the cost to run a cow. We've added about $200 to the cost of running a cow since pre-pandemic. And specifically in 2019, one of the numbers I've called out here, 860 is the number. So USDA estimates that in 2019, the sort of typical cow-calf operation had $860 cost, cash cost, in each cow in their herd. Fast forward to 2023, that estimate is $1,088. So a little more than $200 increase. I don't think this should surprise anybody because if you pull up a budget, most line items in that budget have went up. That's just inflation hitting the cow-calf sector like it's hitting most of the economy, right? The punchline of this is the break even you need for calves, coupled with cow revenue, because those two combine to give you revenue, is quite a bit higher than it was in 2019. And certainly higher than it was, if we go back 10 or 15 years ago on this chart. The good news is the prices have went up more than that, so we are on path to profitability, but you need to keep this stuff in mind when you interpret things like a $3 calf market, is yes, that does sound good, and yes, it's profit, but it isn't as much profit as some would think because the cost to produce that calf is higher than it used to be too. That sets up this slide, which there's a lot of variability on it. This is LMIC's history and then projections for returns over cash costs, still for the cow-calf sector. Starts in 96 and has got projections out to 2025. I'll remind us first, what used to be the spike in this chart was 2014. So in 2014, LMIC estimates the typical herd made $534 per cow. Typical, I don't know what that means in cow-calf, right? There's a lot of variation in this room, much less the US cow-calf sector. But regardless, things were good in 2014 for a lot of cow-calf operators. That used to be the high on this chart. Fast forward to more recently, they estimate that last year, in 2022, it was plus $40. So roughly break even, small positive for a lot of operators. The expectation here in 2023 is plus $244. So now we're talking a strong positive return, which is the net of everything I've given you the last 10 or 12 slides, right? Looking further out, 2024, they're projecting plus 504. 2025, they're projecting plus 690. What's underneath those two is the expectation, on my last slide here, is that cost will not only keep going up, they're actually going to decline a little bit. We could debate if that's going to happen or not, but keep that in mind here. And they're expecting the calf market to get some additional gains, like I gave you in my yellow rows, like second and third slide. So if calves become more valuable and we have cost relief, then by definition profits will improve, right? And the way they're deriving those gets them to $500 and almost $700 in 24 and 25. In the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about these. There's a lot of uncertainty we can talk about on both of those. I'm pretty confident that the typical operation is going to have a real good 2024. I'm really concerned about gray clouds on the consumer that might kill the ability to accomplish the 725. So keep that in mind when I get to some of my concerns on beef demand in a minute. But in the Q&A, we can come back to that. I don't think that dog likes my comments of concern. When I was in Garden City, Brian Brigham was giving a macroeconomic talk, and the batteries went out on his mic about 4 minutes in, and I think it's because he used the term recession too many times. So it's the same kind of stuff. Another resource we have on Ag Manager is in the form of price risk management. So Kevin Duvetter, that used to be in the department, built a lot of these tools. I and some others just help sustain them. It is called Feeder Cattle Risk Management Tool. The whole point of that resource is to, again, help you understand what the expected return of buying a put option or doing a futures hedge or engaging in LRP, USDA subsidized insurance, to protect against feeder cattle price declines. Those are all portrayed relative to do nothing, kind of take the cash market as it goes. I encourage you also to make use of that resource. Again, I'm not telling you to buy any of those things or hedge, but you can use this as a tool to make a more informed assessment. I included this slide just to remind me, the last couple of years there's been a fair number of odd weather events in the state. USDA, Farm Service Agency, as long as we're not operating under a shutdown, is available to visit with you about disaster programs. There's a link there, and if that's relevant, or you know a producer that's had an issue, go back to the FSA website, and there's a whole bunch of disaster programs you can get access to. Yearling market, another chart looks just like the calf one. The punchline here would be is the yearling market, just like the calf market, let me get this to work right, has been growing as well, but the steepness of that curve isn't as steep as the calf market. And keep that in mind for my next comment, because the fed cattle market's also up, but not as steep. And this is the way we'd expect it to play out. The market is sending the signal that the scarcest resource is mama cows that give us calves. So when you're in that setting, the calf market tends to be one that is the hottest, and then followed by that is the feeders, followed by that is fed, because we can adjust the pounds on a fed animal. We can't adjust the number of hooves in the form of the calf crop. Think of it that way. But on balance, the yearly market is following the calf market, and we've added a good $60 or more, depending on what week we compare, to the yearly market compared to 2022. For this segment, we're sitting here at Stocker Field Day. These next two slides are particularly relevant. You can use beefbasis.com to get projected value of gain. So what's the value of putting weight on intermediate weight animals before you sell them to somebody else? And I'm going to do two scenarios with you here just to kind of give you the current market projection for what the value of adding weight is, and then you compare that to your own cost or expected cost of doing it. So again, for Salina, here in the middle of October, we could buy or retain our own. I really need to change this. This says retail. I've had that same typo forever on these slides. It should say retain, so I apologize for that. But I could buy somebody else's, or I could retain my own calf and sell it in January. And in this scenario, I'm saying I got a 6-weight calf. I'm going to put 125 pounds on by the time we get to the middle of January. That's about 1.4 pounds a day. I gave you this 282 earlier as a projected value of that calf. Here, you're potentially buying it for 282. You expect to sell it in January weighing at 267. The net of those two at those weights corresponds with a $242 projected increase in the value of that steer, or $194 per hundredweight. So you take this kind of information and compare it with your own budgeting, what you think is going to cost you in order to accomplish that. And again, if you're comfortable with the risk, if the projected value of gain is notably above your cost, you pull the trigger. If not, you reevaluate. And one of the things you can reevaluate is, this is just an example, there's no written rule you sell on January 17th at those weights. So you can adjust. I sell 2 weeks earlier, 2 weeks later. I speed them up, I slow them down, I change the ration. All those kind of things are in your all's realm of influence. Change those, and you will notably change the punchline here. That's part of the homework at home to do, is the scenarios you're thinking about, what is the projected value gain, and how does that compare with my expected cost of gain, to at least get your arms around expected profit. The parallel exercise can be done for the summer grass market. So look a little bit further out into 2024. April, we might buy, or again, retain somebody's 725 pounder. And when we get close to yours truly's birthday, which is August 20th, so in the middle of August, maybe we sell it weighing 200 pounds more. So I would have had that steer for 133 days, putting about 1.5 pounds on. Expect to pay $277 in April, expect to get $258 out into August. The net of all that is $189 a hundredweight of value added. You take that times 2 because you put 200 pounds on, corresponds to $378 per head of added value to those steers. Again, you compare them to your cost. If your costs are notably below that $378 and you're comfortable with everything, that's pull the trigger and do it. I want to interject here that this slide and the slide before, roughly this time last year, those projected margins were very similar. So the market signals on the value of gain were pretty strong from a historic perspective, but the cost of achieving them is a lot higher than it used to be. So again, I really encourage you to come up with your own cost to compare. Don't just use old rules of thumb on value of gain to say, yes, I want to do this. Please take the time to derive your own cost and figure out the expected margins. This is the last of these kind of slides, the fed cattle market. As I said earlier, kind of following tune, but notice it's not as steep. So fed cattle market is hotter than it was in 2022, but it hasn't gained as much in a dollar per hundredweight perspective, nor would we expect it to, as calves. And we've been sitting in this mid 180s range for a few weeks. I use animal science and industry information, specifically the focus on feedlot survey that's done every month. For those of you in the room that contribute to that, not only to generate the report, but you submit surveys, thank you for that. It's a survey of feed yards around the state that Justin Wagner and his team put out, the focus on feedlot survey. I take specifically the in weight, out weight, death loss, average daily gain, call it, yard performance info from that. And I marry it up with market info. So Kansas feeder cattle prices for when they're coming into the yard, a cost of gain estimate, which is tied to Garden City corn price, and then Kansas negotiated fed cattle prices. Those are the pieces I add to the info from the focus on feedlot survey to come up with this barometer of feedlot returns. Please note when I do this, I'm presuming no hedging. So I'm presuming you pay the going rate for Garden City corn, you paid the going rate for an incoming roughly 7-weight feeder, and you took the negotiated Kansas fed cattle price. So if you do any hedging, this won't fit you, and a lot of cattle are in hedged enterprises, but this shows kind of the unhedged cash margins of the sector. And we are in the midst of a pretty good run for operations that were totally exposed to the market. Specifically, in October, there's a number up there that's 341. So when I put this out in the middle of September, this is done monthly, roughly the middle of the month each month, the projections for steers leaving yards in October that were not hedged was a positive return of 341. Those same steers came into the yard roughly 6 months earlier, and we paid 194 for them. And the associated cost of gain for those steers leaving in October was 129. Let's contrast that with what April looks like. So now let's go further out in the future. Steers that leave the yard in April are projected to have a loss of $31 per head associated with them, even though cost of gain have come down a lot, because those steers have cost of gain of about 108 associated with them, and the fed cattle market has held its own, if not improved a little bit, about 197. I'm doing this long discussion with you because we're bidding away the profit. In the middle here's the feeder cattle price. Those steers that leave in April came into the yard, I estimate we're going to pay about $263 for them, which is notably higher than when I gave you the October example, okay? So if you want to know the core reason that I have strong positive margins projected and then they flip to negative in Q2 starting in April of 24, it's that increase in feeder cattle prices shows up on these margins at some point, and in this case it shows up by April, okay? But we're in the midst of a really good run for unhedged situations in the feed yard industry. This is just a history of that. If you pull up this monthly report, you'll see a chart like this every month. All right, so now I want to share a few thoughts about beef demand, but I'm going to take a quick drink. So, beef demand. My first two comments, when I gave you the quick summary, I told you the tight supplies was the first point. Hopefully I've given you plenty of evidence, and most of you knew that when you walked in, but you have numbers in your mind there. I have not talked much about consumer willingness to pay for beef, they're interested in it and so forth, and I'm gonna do that for a few slides. But the reason I'm gonna do that with you is, just because we have tighter supplies does not guarantee we have higher cattle prices. If you have tight supplies and yet the consumer's in a really bad shape and demand falters, you can actually go backwards on prices as well. There's no mathematical rule that just because we have fewer cattle means we're gonna get higher prices, okay? Is the point of that. It's great that beef demand's been okay so far, but we can't take that for granted, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. I have some concerns about the health of the US consumer, is where I'm going with this, and I think it's important to just remember that comment. In the spirit of making sure everybody's awake, raise your hand if you've ever listened to one of Matt Perrier's podcasts. All right, I think now everybody else raise your left hand. That's good, raise them up. That's how we know we're still awake, when you got a dry economist in front of you. All right, that's good. All right, so in November, I did a session with Matt, and I belabored this, but more generally, I encourage you to make use of his podcast. I think it's pretty cool. It's got a lot of good information, and it's not just economists. Actually, it's rarely an economist, so we won't kill you every week and every month with econ stuff there. But I described this three-legged stool, and I think this visual is useful to understand the US market, US beef market. There are three main outlets for beef that we produce here in the US. We could export it to foreign countries. We could keep it here at home and go through largely retail channels for at home, mainly grocery store, club stores, those kind of things, at home beef consumption. Or we could keep it at home and it go through food service for restaurant consumption. So there's two domestic channels and there's one foreign channel. The three-legged stool analogy, I find that as a useful mental picture to remind us there's three different channels. We sell different products through all three. But importantly, the pandemic revealed just how distinct those channels are. So remember, the pandemic sort of started March of 2020. Raise your hand if you went out and had a ribeye steak 3 times in April of 2020. This room probably had ribeyes at home in April of 2020, right? But it was hard to get into a restaurant to eat them at the time, is why I'm doing that. So it's my way of reminding you that we kind of mothballed food service for several months in 2020. Visually, that was the equivalent of taking that leg off the stool, because we took that channel away. Fortunately for this industry, domestic beef demand was very strong, and that was sort of the equivalent of doubling the length of the domestic retail leg here. But it was way out of balance, right? Because we struggled to transition products that were gonna go through food service into our own retail channel. So this stool was certainly not stable anymore. The net of it was good for the industry because we actually had more growth in retail demand than we had a decline in food service demand. So the net of that turned out to be positive. But we're fortunate that was the case. And I use this analogy to remind us all, we send different products and all three channels matter, and external shocks can really mess with things, okay? The health of the domestic consumer is really relevant for two of these legs, is where I'm going with some of my concerns. I'm not saying we're gonna go so far to shut down all restaurants, don't overreact to my comment, but we need to remember that these different channels get impacted in different ways. The pandemic was an extreme version of that, but all three are very relevant to sustain aggregate demand for US beef. This is the only chart I have on export demand. I'm happy to take more questions if you want. But for several months, we've had slippage in demand for US beef. I do not think this is because there's an image problem or quality problem. I think it's a global macroeconomic pause on their ability or willingness to pay up for US beef, okay? So the strength of that leg on my stool is weaker today than it was 18 months ago, is the point. I have two slides like this that I'm gonna belabor, be a little bit of a historian with you, because I think it's very instructive about where we're at domestically. What this chart is, and again, it's from LMIC, vertically is the average retail price of beef, and horizontally is pounds per capita. So think amount of beef consumed per person. It's our estimate of that. Per capita beef consumption is simply what we produce domestically, plus what we import, minus what we export. Those are all pounds, so that's a domestic beef availability number, and we divide it by the US population, our resident count, to put it on a per person basis, okay? So the first point from that is, all else equal, if we're notably reducing domestic production, we're probably gonna reduce domestic consumption per person. If we import more, we'll offset some of that. If we export less, we'll offset some of that, but both of them are small compared to the domestic production piece. So we're on the path of reducing beef availability per person, is the point of that, okay? The history lesson would be, is we've been here before in some different ways. To your far right, starting in 1997 through 2007, all these years, these are scatter plots. So it's specific intersections of consumption and price by year. For several years there, over a decade, we had upper 60s, so 64 to 68 pounds of beef consumed per person, and we sort of hovered in this price range. And then when we left 2007 and we hit the macroeconomic challenges of the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, 2010, we basically just moved to the left on this chart. And that's why I made a red arrow, because we moved to the left in the spirit that there's less beef consumed per person, but we failed to accomplish a higher price. So we just moved to the left. The reason this arrow is flat, no slope to it, is we shrunk the industry. Less beef consumed at home, but we failed to get a higher price. Real narrowly going from 08 to 09, we not only shrunk, we actually lowered the price. So if you get if the market buys less of your product at a lower price, that's a clear example of demand decline. And the recession was a lot of that, but nonetheless, there was a clear evidence of beef demand decline domestically in 09 versus 08. The good news is, and I'm doing this history lesson for a reason, because we're at another pivot point. The good news is the last few years have been a lot more fun to talk about. So fast forward to where the green arrow is. When we went from 2019 to 2020, and we went 2020 to 2021, we had clear evidence of demand growth. Because in both cases, we consumed more per person and we sold that beef at a higher price. So anytime you grow your industry in the sense that both P and Q grew, that's simple evidence of demand growth. That's why there's a green arrow. In 2022, we had a slight slip back, but not a big change. The real reason I give you that belabored lesson is we're at another pivot point. I told you tight supplies are coming. Everybody knew that when they walked in, but to give you some context on that on this chart, LMIC projects that for this year, we're gonna have 57 pounds of beef per person consumed. Next year, 55. In 2025, 53. And for those of you that can read this chart starts at 53 pounds. So I'm very confident 2 years from now when I bring this chart to you, we will change the x-axis. So I'll have something like 52 or 51 or something as a starting point to capture where we're at in 2025. The unknown is where we're gonna be vertically, which is why I have both arrows up there. So if we again shrink the amount of beef per person and have the unfortunate case where beef prices come down, I'll be sitting here having to say we definitely had a demand decline, because it'll be a repeat of that 08, 09 history lesson I gave you, and that would not be good for the industry. Conversely, if the green line plays out and we shrink per person, but we accomplish a higher beef price, that could actually be a very good thing in the spirit of beef demand growth. That actually is possible, and there are years that somebody like me would be here saying demand is growing. Even though the consumption went down, that was dictated because there wasn't enough available. People were bidding so strong for it, the price went up. I'm telling you, the demand was stronger, is the punchline. So Glynn is hoping to come back to you and say that green arrow played out, but I'm trying to be very frank with you. The next 2 years, we're gonna learn a lot about which of those arrows is realized, and we're gonna have different charts like this, okay? So my first 2 bullet points, this is all about that second point, is the ability to sustain high calf prices and yearling prices and fed cattle prices is not just lower hoof count, it's also what happens on this chart. I'm gonna spend less time on these and take some questions, but I have the privilege to lead a project called the Meat Demand Monitor. It is beef and pork checkoff funded. Every month since February of 2020, we survey nationally a representative sample, and we monitor a lot of stuff on domestic meat consumption, meat demand, preferences, and so forth. I'm happy to take questions on that if you want. I'm just gonna highlight a few of the key points for today. This is a ribeye steak demand chart. The punchline is, sitting here as 2023 is going forward, we had a peak in domestic ribeye demand in 2022. So demand has softened, but it's still stronger than it was pre-pandemic. This is the punchline of that. Ground beef demand, same statement. So sitting here, now the latest that's up here is July and August are the 2 up there. I closed data collection on September before I came in today. So next week I will have September info. But regardless, the peak ground beef demand was also in 2022. So demand has slipped some, but it's still better than it was pre-pandemic, is the punchline of those 2 charts, okay? If you want to read more on that, one of my fellow geeks and partners in crime is Jason Lusk. Some of you may know his name. He's now dean down at Oklahoma State. He has to wear an orange shirt now, but otherwise he's a good guy. He's done a lot of work with me on related topics, and we've basically summarized the strength of beef demand and meat demand more broadly in this article if you guys want to read about it. But things like vegan, vegetarian diets and so forth, they exist, and I'm happy to talk about that, but they're not growing rapidly, and we belabor that. So kind of keep those kind of things in mind. The reason I think 23 demand is weaker than 22, and the reason I'm concerned about 24 and 25, is the health of the U.S. consumer because of their wages relative to the cost of living. So there's not a macroeconomist on the panel today, so I'm going to do that for 2 slides. But raise your hand if you're younger than 45. So I'm 43, I gave that earlier, okay? Now of that same group, raise your hand if prior to 2 years ago you experienced 8% inflation. Good, everybody answered it right, all right? So 8% inflation is a fairly new thing for most of us. I mean, if you're 60, you've lived through it before, but even then you were at a different stage of life, right, when you went through it and so forth. Why am I highlighting that? Is the bulk of our country has just went through elevated inflation and their wages didn't keep up. That's the punchline of this chart and this chart. So real wages is what I make adjusted for inflation, the cost of living, right? And the bulk of US consumers are notably worse off than they were right as the pandemic hit. And this is not a political statement at all. I mean, there's multiple administrations involved and so forth. Do not get that confounded. The punchline is wages haven't kept up with cost of living for the bulk of the public. If you want another statistic from that meat demand monitor effort I'm always doing, about 80% of the public today says their finances are the same or worse than they were a year ago. So only 20% say they're in a better financial situation, okay? So they're cautious, if not pessimistic, about their finances on whole, and that doesn't surprise me at all. If you want a lot more info on that, we talked about it on the US Farm Report, and there's some special reports on our Ag Manager website, but the punchline would be the bulk are concerned, and it's pretty clear, we have lots of evidence in this project and lots of other past research, is when you have consumer incomes or simply sentiment by consumers that declines, that's not good for beef demand. It's not good for a lot of categories that consumers buy, but beef demand is not immune. So a core reason I'm concerned about 24 and 25 is not the quality of beef, and it's not the fact that the public wants beef, because it's very clear that they do. It's a macroeconomic affordability kind of story, right? For quote unquote average Joe, because if your wages aren't keeping up, you're gonna tighten your wallet in a lot of places. I hope I'm being Dr. Bear, PhD ag economist, or often Dr. Bear. I'm well aware of that, but it is my job to kind of remind you, and that's why I gave you those 2 bullet points up front, is the tight supplies alone don't guarantee that we're gonna sustain higher cattle prices if in fact we have notable demand decline. I hope we don't, but it's my job to remind you that that's possible. So, as I mentioned earlier, a PDF of these slides is available. This is the direct link if you want to take note. I talked you through how to do that, but I'm happy to take questions as long as Dale lets me do it.
Are there any questions for Glynn? Now's not the time to be afraid to ask this man a question, if you have one.
I ask it, I know it's a loaded, I mean, there is no answer, but how close do you think we'll get to that 32?
Yeah, so Wes is asking me, I try to give context of why I don't think we'll go above 32 million cows. 31 is the number that Glynn thinks the budgets might fit, is where I'm coming from with that. History would say we'll go past that, but whether we go a full million past it or not is up for debate. If we go to 32 million cows and we don't get rid of Glynn's concerns on beef demand, and we fail to grow demand abroad, I think we'll have negatives on that cow-calf chart by 27. It's a different way to answer that question. We will have expanded too much relative to demand for beef if that occurred, which is probably the punchline you're fishing for. So the best hedge on that is to grow beef demand, right? And hope that, frankly, macroeconomic stuff gets better, which unfortunately is beyond the control of anybody in the beef industry, right? Because there's much bigger forces at play that dictate all that. I gave you exports as part of my answer because I personally think we got to export more beef. 3-5% of the higher income around the world will pay up for ribeye, target them and so forth, is the way to grow aggregate demand. But that's going to be extra needed if we get to that 32 or certainly above 32 million cows. So my 32 is a word of caution, the amount of beef we'd have with it, and what I know that would do to putting downward pressure on everything unless we have beef demand growth. I hope that helps. Yes, Rich?
Glynn, historically, government shutdowns have really had a transfer impact on beef prices.
So the question is, trying to get me in trouble, what's been the effect of shutdowns in the past on beef prices? There's not clear evidence that I'm aware of any effect there. Political unrest and people getting ticked off at both parties and that kind of stuff shows up if you read the news and so forth. I suspect the duration of a shutdown is probably the real, so a shutdown that lasts 12 hours, I'm not sure it's going to have any effect on consumer willingness to pay for beef and so on and so forth. The news will talk a lot about it, but I'm not sure it'd have a lot of effect. But if we had a multi-week shutdown and people get concerned, particularly if it was multiple week and the global market started getting less confident in the US economy, then you start having things that directly hit the pocketbook. So if you start having macroeconomic forces that increase interest rates, that increase credit card payments and so forth, now we're going to start talking direct consumer effects, right? But I don't think that happens in one day shutdown. It's got to have some legs to it. Somebody in the room probably knows every one of the shutdowns and can tell you more. One that's in my mind is the fall of 2013. We had a 3-week shutdown. The reason it's on my mind is at that point in time, mandatory price reporting, or LMR, so fed cattle, wholesale beef prices are part of mandatory price reporting. They were not deemed essential in 2013. So any geek like me that does historical analysis, when you pull up an Excel file, there are no values for 3 weeks in the fall, October of 2013. Now we find ways to populate them and so on and so forth, but the government wasn't required to perform that action. Fast forward to now, both sides, fed cattle buyers and sellers, have put pressure on the system to deem that effort essential. So my understanding is USDA AMS will still be working to put out those reports even if we have a shutdown. I'll interject that because you brought up shutdown. But make no mistake, there's a lot of other functions of government that would not be. I made the comment about FSA earlier as I went through and so forth. Exactly how you work on buying LRP and so forth, not exactly clear to me how you do that during the shutdown and so forth. So there'd be disruptions for this room if the shutdown lasts for a while. By no means am I taking, I'm not making a political statement we should or shouldn't have one. It's just I think there would be some implications if there's duration. If it's one day, I'm not sure it's a big deal. It's a lot to talk about in the news, but I'm not sure there's a market effect if it's one day. Yeah. What about the beef that is imported? Is that what you asked me? Yep. Yeah, so for context, we import 8 to 12% of the volume that's consumed. Like to give you a 20 or 30 year history, that's the relative amount. So I'll give you everybody in the room context. We import some every year and we vary exactly how much. When I was walking us through the per capita consumption exercise, it's the amount of beef consumed per person is what we produce plus what's imported minus what we export. So it's a mitigating factor on that story, right? If we import more, we'll have less of a decline in the amount of beef that's consumed per person when I was walking us through that scatter plot. General expectation is we'll import a little bit more in the next 2 years. We've done that in the past in these cattle cycles as a way to help sustain beef flow. So I anticipate imports will be up a little bit more in the next 2 years, but not a lot. So keep in mind that 8 to 12% is still a small minority of the total amount of beef that goes through the US system. So we're not talking it all of a sudden become 20 or 30 or 40%. It would be towards the upper end of that range, maybe to 15%, so to give you some context on it. But the main effect is it mitigates the decline in domestic production on that scatter plot where I give us the long history effect. Yes, so that scatter plot I gave you, LMIC has the projections, like the specific number was 2025, it was down to 53.1 pounds. They have a presumption on imports and exports there. They are pessimistic on exports, so what we produce is more likely to stay here, and they have imports going up a little bit, consistent with what I just told you. Yeah. Bill, anyone? Go ahead. Yeah, so Bill's calling me out to do a better job of predicting beef demand. He's asking me if I have any leading indicators that would give us some more confidence of where we're going. And I agree with you that it's harder to predict than supply, if for no simple reason, the biological lag in the cattle industry, in the next 2 years, we have some confidence of what's going on with hoof count and so forth, right? So the best one we have today is household financial sentiment. And this predates the meat demand monitor I was talking about. So for almost 50 years, the University of Michigan has done a consumer sentiment index, and they're not worried about meat, but they look at things like gas prices and home prices and so forth, and there is a consumer sentiment index from there. I mimic that in the meat demand monitor, so I have kind of a sentiment of the U.S. household on the finance, and it is a good leading indicator, like narrowly in our meat world and more generally for the consumer in the University of Michigan's effort. It's the one that's the best. It's not perfect by any means, but it does, when financial sentiment's declining, people tend to tighten their wallet. That's the easiest way I know to say that. And that's why I gave you the concerns I did today, is those sentiments would indicate that's going to continue. Yes, Tom, and then I'll probably need to hand over the mic. Yep. I don't work for the Federal Reserve is the first disclaimer. I do talk to bankers, yeah, and they're almost as exciting as ag economists, Tom. So there is a fair debate whether inflation is rising again or not. I don't know what crude oil has done since I sat down, but over the last several weeks, oil is rising, and historically that makes us concerned about inflation and so forth. The general consensus is the Federal Reserve may not be done raising because they have this mandate to try to get rid of inflation. I think a lot of economists would say we haven't done enough yet to be confident we've killed inflation. If you subscribe to all of that, higher interest rates are yet to come. I don't know if it's 1% more or 3% more is like the follow-up how much more, but I personally think we're going to have higher rates in 24 before we go lower yet. At least another percent, which directly, real quickly, will impact borrowing rates on a heifer, among other things that I was talking about earlier, right? So I'm staying through lunch. I hate to cut off the questions, but I know you want to stay on time, so thank you guys.